The scent of roasting thyme and glazed ham didn't just fill the air. It pressed against the back of my throat, a physical, sickening reminder of what was happening 2 floors down. It was the smell of belonging, but not mine. It was the scent of a perfect family portrait being taken in the opulent dining room while I sat on the edge of a twin bed in the converted attic, tracing the cracked glaze of a cheap ceramic mug. "Just relax, sweetie," my mother, Amelia, had said earlier that evening, her voice a practiced blend of saccharine concern and dismissive finality. She was standing in the doorway of my tiny room, already dressed in a shimmering sapphire gown that caught the hall light like the surface of a deep, calm sea. Everything about her was polished. The perfect blonde waves, the diamond studs that glittered like captive stars, the way her hand rested casually on the mahogany frame, a clear signal that her attention was finite and already winding down. "It's just a dinner, Clara, a very small, private business dinner. It would be so dreadfully boring for you," she'd finished, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Dreadfully boring. I was 22, a recent graduate with a degree in architectural history and a mind that felt like a perpetually open, overstuffed filing cabinet. I was a sponge for context, for conversation, for anything that hinted at the intricate, gilded mechanics of the world my mother and stepfather, Marcus Thorne, inhabited. Boring. No. Exclusionary. Absolutely. The dinner was not small. It was the annual pre-IPO gathering Marcus hosted for his core investors and the board members of Thorne Venture Capital. It was where deals were subtly cemented, where alliances were forged over crystal glasses, and where the future of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, the source of the life I nominally shared but never truly owned, was discussed. And in that future, it was clear I had no seat at the table. My mother's casual dismissal wasn't new. It was the theme music to my life, a soft, insistent melody of being not quite right, not quite polished, not quite enough. Amelia had married Marcus 10 years ago, trading the cramped, beautiful chaos of our old apartment, where art supplies and books covered every surface, for this mausoleum of minimalist luxury in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. Marcus was kind in an abstract, distant way, but his world demanded a certain type of woman, and Amelia had transformed herself into that type. I, however, remained the unpredictable variable, the reminder of her less-than-perfect past. I was still Clara, the girl who preferred the dusty archives to the crowded social calendar, the girl with the perpetually ink-stained fingers and a tendency to speak uncomfortable truths. I pushed myself off the bed, the mattress springs groaning in protest, a small, defiant noise in the silent house. My reflection in the small, wall-mounted mirror was a study in contrasts. A plain, black silk slip dress, my one nod to feeling like a human being on this evening, overlaid by a thick hand-knitted gray cardigan. My usually messy, dark brown hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and my eyes, the same sharp, startling green as my deceased father's, looked too intense for my face. The silence was the worst. It wasn't the natural silence of a peaceful house. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an active exclusion. It meant I was meant to be invisible, a ghost in the machine. And the one thing I was truly good at was refusing to be invisible. I picked up my laptop, a battered, sticker-covered machine that looked ancient next to Marcus's sleek, obsidian black workstations. My fingers flew over the keyboard, the familiar tactile response a comfort. I wasn't scrolling through social media, nor was I catching up on a missed lecture. I was doing what Marcus thought I was incapable of: work. My work. For the past 6 months, operating out of this attic sanctuary, I had been the lead historical consultant on the restoration of the old Sentinel Theater, a monumental, Art Deco masterpiece that had sat derelict for 30 years. The project was the darling of the city's Preservation Trust, an architectural challenge of immense proportions, and unbeknownst to my family, it was facing a critical snag. The primary funding was dependent on the completion of the Structural Integrity Report, which, thanks to a bureaucratic nightmare, was tied up in City Council. Without that report, the project would stall, the current funding would lapse, and a wrecking ball would likely swing through the city's most beautiful memory. I had spent all day wrestling with the City Hall planning documents, my brain a knotted wire of old bylaws and engineering codes. I knew the project manager, A gruff, brilliant man named Elias was desperate. He had a tight deadline and a televised interview later tonight, a last-ditch effort to put public pressure on the council members. Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter drifted up the main stairwell, followed by the clinking of glasses. It sounded so jovial, so complete. I slammed my laptop shut, the sudden noise a small, satisfying rebellion. That was it. I couldn't stand the proximity of their flawless joy and my perfect solitude. "It's just a dinner, Clara." My blood began to simmer. They wanted me to be small and silent and tucked away. But I had a voice, and tonight I had an opportunity. I picked up my phone. It was 7:55 p.m. The Sentinel Theater piece was scheduled for the 8 o'clock news. I didn't call Elias directly. That would be messy. I called the one person I could rely on for a last-minute surgical strike, my old college friend, Chloe. Chloe was a force of nature, a quick-witted, ruthless investigative journalist now working the local politics beat for one of the major evening news programs. "Chloe, it's me. I need a favor and I need it now." I didn't waste time with greetings. "Clara, what the hell? I'm about to go live, honey. What is it?" Her voice was rushed, the energy of the newsroom crackling in the background. "The Sentinel Theater. Elias is on tonight, right? I need you to do something to his microphone. I need you to get him to say 2 words, Chloe." "Thorn Venture Capital." A brief, sharp silence. "Thorn Venture, your stepdad's company, why?" "Because their subsidiary, Thorn Holdings, owns the land deed for the back section of the theater's parking structure. It's an obscure detail, but it's their leverage to get the city to approve the new building they want to put up instead. It's a conflict of interest that could tank the entire preservation if the city doesn't prioritize the historical trust over the land acquisition." I spoke in clipped, urgent sentences, feeding her the details I had just found hours ago. "If the city council knows the primary blocker has a financial stake in its failure, it forces their hand to release the report and save face." "Clara, this is huge." "It's a bombshell political angle, but nothing. I can't move it through the bureaucracy in time. You can put it on the air. Do it, Chloe. Ask Elias why he thinks the funding is being held up. Ask him who benefits from the stall. I've just texted you the details. Force the name. The pressure has to be public, and it has to be tonight." Chloe let out a low, impressed whistle. "You've got brass, Clara, okay? You're on, give me 5. I hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs, a thrilling drumbeat of adrenaline and fear. This wasn't just about the Sentinel Theater. This was about inserting myself into the narrative of power that had so easily excluded me. I crept down to the second-floor landing, where the main staircase met the hallway. I didn't dare go any lower. I pressed my back against the wall, flattening myself into the shadows of a massive potted fern. I could hear the murmur of deep, male voices, the quiet clink of silver, the occasional high, melodic trill of my mother's laughter. The dinner was in full swing. I pulled out my phone and went to the local news app. The anchor's face was solemn on the small screen. 8 o'clock. The segment began with sweeping shots of the Sentinel, the majestic, decaying dome, the faded murals, the heartbreaking beauty of its neglect. The camera then cut to Elias, standing in front of the theater's cracked marble facade, his face a mask of weary determination. My breath hitched. I could hear the distant sounds of the dinner party right through the floorboards. A sudden silence, perhaps due to a lull in conversation, or maybe just the rhythmic, quiet chewing of very expensive food. The timing felt unnervingly synchronous. Elias began to speak, detailing the history, the cultural significance, the ready funding that was waiting to save it. Then, Chloe's voice cut in, sharp and precise, like a surgical instrument. "Mr. Vance, with all this public support and secured private funding, why is the structural report still being withheld by the city council? Who benefits from the delay?" Elias looked genuinely pained. He started to speak about bureaucratic red tape, but Chloe cut him off, leaning into the camera with the ruthless intensity of a hunter. "But we've learned, sir, that a major local landholder, a subsidiary of Thorn Venture Capital, has a clear interest in the failure of this preservation. Can you confirm if Thorn Holdings owns the contested deed, and if this is creating an unacknowledged conflict of interest on the council?" Elias looked directly into the camera. He hesitated for a long, heavy second, the longest second of my life, and then, with a sigh of relief that was palpable, he spoke the truth. "Yes, that is a fact, and I believe the citizens of this city deserve to know why a private entity with a clear, competing financial interest is being allowed to quietly hold a historical landmark hostage." The screen flashed to a graphic. City Council conflict. THORNE Venture Holdings implicated in Sentinel stall. And then, the sound from the dining room below me erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a single, terrifying sound. The shatter of a heavy crystal decanter hitting the marble floor, followed by the deep, resonant, and utterly furious bellow of Marcus Thorne. "What is that?" The party had stopped. The soft hum of polite conversation was replaced by a dead, chilling silence, followed by the rapid, frantic tap-tap-tap of my mother's high heels crossing the room. I stood there, pressed into the shadows, the tiny screen of my phone glowing with the now ongoing news segment. The familiar smell of the dinner suddenly felt suffocating, no longer just a reminder of exclusion, but the acrid smoke of a battlefield I had just ignited. I heard my mother's voice, sharp with panic, float up the stairs. "Marcus, darling, turn it off. It's the local news, it's nonsense." "Nonsense? Amelia, Thorn Venture Capital is on the goddamn screen. I need to know who leaked this. I need to know who knew about that deed." Marcus's voice was the sound of pure, unbridled power unraveling. I felt a dizzying wave of fear, but beneath it, a strange, exhilarating rush. I hadn't been invited to their dinner. I had been relegated to the quiet, dark corners. But tonight, they hadn't just not seen me. They had seen my work on their television screen, and it had blown their evening, and perhaps their entire venture, to pieces. I slipped back up the stairs, my heart pounding a rhythm of triumph and dread. The invisibility was over. The war had begun, and the scent of roasted thyme was now forever mixed with the smell of revolution. The noise downstairs escalated from sharp, furious bellowing to a muffled, desperate argument. Marcus Thorne's voice, usually a deep, controlled baritone, was cracking with outrage. My mother's attempts at placation were thin, reedy things, instantly shredded by his wrath. They were discussing me. I knew it, even though my name hadn't been explicitly shouted yet. The sheer impossibility of the moment was what was stunning them. How could the girl they had so casually tucked away, the dreadfully boring bookworm, have delivered a precise, surgical strike against their multi-billion-dollar operation from an attic room? I locked the attic door, an absurd gesture of self-protection, but one that felt necessary as the house throbbed with their panic. I sank onto the edge of the twin bed again, the adrenaline spike wearing off, leaving behind a shaking, cold exhaustion. Fear, raw and metallic, tasted like copper on my tongue. I had just declared war on the most powerful man I knew, the man whose wealth paid for the roof over my head. My inheritance wasn't money. It was this fragile, conditional existence. And I had just put it all at risk. My phone screen still showed the news clip, the banner graphic, THORNE Venture Holdings implicated, a beacon of my momentary triumph. I quickly text Chloe, "Thank you. Get me the full transcript ASAP, and don't stop digging." She replied instantly, "My pleasure, you beautiful architectural anarchist. They're going to lose their minds." Chloe's excitement was infectious, but it didn't dull the sound of heavy footsteps ascending the main stairs. Not my mother's delicate tap, but Marcus's deliberate, pounding tread, each step shaking the very structure of the old house. He wasn't stopping at the second floor. He was coming for me. I stood up, squaring my shoulders. There was no running now, no pretending I was asleep or absent. I had initiated this confrontation. I had to see it through. The hammering on the door was less a knock and more a demand for entry. "Clara, open this door. Now." Marcus's voice was low, dangerous. The sound of a predator denied its prey. I didn't open it. I needed a moment to gather my thoughts, to solidify my defense. "The door is locked, Marcus. We can talk in the morning." "Don't be ridiculous. We are talking now. Your mother is hysterical." Do you have any idea the damage you just caused? The stock is all ready." He stopped, perhaps realizing he shouldn't be discussing financials through a closed door. His voice dropped to a controlled, lethal whisper. "You are coming down and explaining how you got that information and why you used it to embarrass this family and jeopardize a major acquisition." "I got the information because I read the documents," I retorted, matching his intensity. "I read the old city planning minutes, the land acquisition deeds, the subsidiary filings. I read the documents you didn't think I would look at because I was too busy being dreadfully boring." There was a heavy silence on the other side of the door. Then, a click. I hadn't realized he had a master key. The door swung open slowly, revealing Marcus standing under the single harsh bulb of the attic hallway. He was still in his bespoke suit, his silk tie slightly askew, his face a mask of furious disbelief. Behind him, my mother peered around his shoulder, her sapphire dress a jarring splash of color against the gloom, her face pale and pinched with pure fear. "Clara," my mother whimpered, her voice barely a thread. "How could you? We gave you everything." "Everything but respect," I corrected, stepping forward into the light, letting him see my defiance. "You gave me silence, a room, and a conditional allowance. You didn't give me a seat at the table, so I built my own." Marcus ignored my mother, his eyes, cold, slate gray, fixed on mine. "The Sentinel Theater is a distraction. A beautiful but expensive loss leader the city will eventually dump. Thorn Holdings owns the adjacent parcel, yes. We were using the deed to apply pressure on the council to approve our new high-density commercial tower, a project worth 50 times this decaying relic. You knew that. So why, Clara? Why sabotage the project that supports this lifestyle you enjoy?" "I am not sabotaging your lifestyle, Marcus. I am forcing you to operate with integrity," I said, the words ringing with an authority I barely recognized as my own. "The Sentinel Theater is not a distraction. It's a monument. It's heritage. And more importantly, the process you used to acquire that leverage was a clear conflict of interest, designed to strong-arm the city council into prioritizing your commercial interest over its cultural obligation." He took a step toward me, his shadow swallowing the room. "You don't understand how the world works, child. This is business. This is how you win." "And this," I gestured toward my laptop, which still showed the news screen, "is how you lose, Marcus. I used the rules, the same arcane, bureaucratic rules you rely on to expose your hand. By the time the news cycle is done with this, the city council will be forced to release the structural report just to save their own necks. They'll have no choice but to let the preservation go forward. You won't get your commercial tower on that site." My mother finally broke free of her paralysis. "Clara, stop. He is going to cut you off. He will take everything." She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging in. "You don't have a job. You don't have savings. This is financial suicide." I gently but firmly pulled my arm away. "I'm an architectural historian, Mom. I have my skills and my degree. I'm not as helpless as you think. And I already have a job. I was the one who found the conflict of interest. Elias offered me a position as a lead researcher for the Preservation Trust 2 weeks ago, and I accepted. I just hadn't told either of you yet. I didn't want to explain why I would choose a struggling nonprofit over an easy, nepotistic role in Thorn Venture." Marcus's eyes narrowed, a slow realization dawning. "You're working for the opposition. You've been feeding them information from inside my house." His voice was cold, flat, utterly devoid of emotion, now more terrifying than his rage. "You are a snake, Clara." "I'm a pragmatist," I corrected him, "and a historian who believes in the power of context. You created a situation where I had to choose between your silence and my own convictions. I chose the latter." He didn't yell again. He simply stared at me, a profound, chilling look of dismissal crossing his face. "Get out." My mother gasped. "Marcus." "No, Amelia. Not out of the room, out of my house. Tonight, I won't have a saboteur under my roof. Pack whatever you can fit in one suitcase. I will have a driver take you to a hotel, and your things will be sent after you've found a permanent address." He turned to my mother, his tone instantly shifting back to the controlled, commanding husband. "Amelia, go downstairs. Tell the remaining guests there has been a family emergency and the dinner is concluded." My mother stared at me, tears welling in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of sheer, self-pitying horror at the disruption to her gilded life. She didn't argue with him. She simply turned and fled down the stairs, leaving me alone with the man I had just financially wounded. Marcus looked back at me, his lip curling slightly. "You wanted a seat at the table, Clara. You just bought yourself a whole new kitchen. Enjoy the heat." He left the attic, not bothering to close the door, the heavy, deliberate thud of his steps receding down the stairs until the silence rushed back in. I was shaking, not with fear anymore, but with the aftermath of a massive adrenaline dump. I was homeless, penniless, and professionally at war. But for the first time in 10 years, I felt an almost unbearable lightness, a sense of having finally thrown off a costume that had never fit. The Sentinel Theater was saved. My integrity was intact. I grabbed my small, worn duffel bag and my laptop. I didn't bother with clothes. They were just borrowed fabric anyway. The only things that mattered were the documents, the research, and the machine that held them. As I walked down the main staircase for the very last time, the dining room door was slightly ajar. Through the crack, I saw my mother standing alone by the massive oak table, picking up the shimmering fragments of the shattered crystal decanter. She looked small, utterly defeated, and completely lost in the vast, echoing room. I paused, but I didn't speak. I knew any conversation would be a repeat of the last 10 years. Why can't you just be quiet? Why can't you just conform? I walked past, my cheap sneakers silent on the thick Persian runner. I reached the front door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cold, clean night air of the city. I was alone, exposed, and free. And somewhere in the dark, dilapidated beauty of the Sentinel Theater, my new life was waiting. A black town car, Marcus's final, cold gesture, was waiting at the curb. The driver, a polite, stoic man I knew as Robert, opened the back door. "Where to, Miss Clara?" Robert asked, his voice neutral. I looked up at the vast, silent house, then at the glittering, dangerous skyline. "The cheapest, closest hotel to the Sentinel Theater, Robert. I have to be there first thing in the morning. I have a lot of work to do." I got in the car, closed the door, and watched the life I was supposed to have disappear in the rearview mirror. The show was over. The real work had just begun. The hotel room Robert dropped me off at felt like a temporary holding cell, sterile, cramped, and smelling faintly of industrial-strength lemon cleaner. It was 3 blocks from the Sentinel Theater, a distance I could practically taste. I didn't sleep. The adrenaline had curdled into a tight, nervous energy that kept me tethered to the present moment. I spent the hours before dawn on my laptop, not dwelling on the past, but mapping the future. The immediate fallout was exactly as I'd predicted. By 3:00 a.m., the story had gone national, not for its architectural significance, but for the corporate scandal. The phrase conflict of interest was now inextricably linked to Thorn Venture Capital. Marcus's power was absolute, but the market was a brutal, fickle master. I saw reports flash across financial news feeds. Thorn Venture stock had dropped 4% in after-hours trading. A small, vindictive smile touched my lips. That was my tuition fee for the next decade. At 7:00 a.m., I checked out, leaving the key card on the cheap laminate desk. The duffel bag with my laptop felt heavy, a repository of both my past pain and my future potential. Stepping out onto the pavement, I felt the city wake up around me. I walked quickly, the chill of the morning air cutting through my thin cardigan. 3 blocks later, I stood before the Sentinel Theater. It was magnificent, even in its state of decay. The facade was a symphony of terracotta and aged bronze, a towering testament to the ambition of the 1930s. But up close, the neglect was heartbreaking. Cracks spiderwebbing across the marble entrance, dust-caked windows, and a massive, rusted padlock on the main doors. It was a giant sleeping under a blanket of shame. I found the back entrance, a less grand door tucked next to a dumpster, and pushed past a sagging chain-link fence. The interior was a shock of cold and shadow. Elias Vance, the project manager, was already there. He was a man in his late 50s, his face perpetually etched with the worry lines of a man who loved something too much to let it go. He was wearing a hard hat, even indoors, and was shouting instructions to 2 engineers over a crackling 2-way radio. He spotted me, and his face, usually stern and weary, cracked into a grin of utter relief. He strode toward me, his heavy boots echoing in the vast, empty space. "Clara, thank God, I didn't think you'd actually show up after you blew up the city council." He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "The council called in an emergency session at 6:00 a.m. They released the structural integrity report. It passed. They want to bury the controversy. The project is officially moving forward, and the land issue is now a separate, non-urgent civil dispute." A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. The Sentinel is saved. It wasn't just a building, it was my proof of concept. Elias clapped me hard on the shoulder. "You saved it, kid. You did more in one news cycle than 6 months of lobbying. So, you ready to start work? You start now." He led me through the cavernous lobby, pointing out the restoration challenges. The delicate stencils needing archival matching, the water damage on the plasterwork, the sheer logistical nightmare of securing the dome. He didn't offer a desk or a paycheck. That would come later, he promised. He offered me a crisis. First order of business, the archives. The architectural plans are secured, but we're missing the original inventory of decorative elements. The City Historical Trust thinks a box was misplaced during the transition 10 years ago. It's vital. We need it to match the original gold leaf in the mezzanine. Without the historical precedent, we can't start the finishing work. He led me to a narrow, rickety elevator that smelled of mildew. "This goes down to the sub-basement. It's where we store the stuff that doesn't fit anywhere else. It's dusty, Clara, and probably full of rats." "I thrive in dust and chaos, Elias," I assured him, adjusting the strap of my duffel bag. "I just left a room that was too clean." He smiled again, a genuine, tired smile. "Go get 'em, historian." The sub-basement was exactly as promised, a dark, echoing labyrinth of concrete columns and forgotten things. The air was thick and cold. I flipped a light switch, and a few bare bulbs sputtered to life, illuminating towering stacks of old film reels, broken theater seats, and most importantly, walls lined with damp, unlabeled cardboard boxes. My job was to find one specific box, a needle in a historical haystack. I started methodically, box by box, applying the same intense focus I had used to dissect Marcus's corporate filings. I was looking for a municipal label, a signature, a date, any piece of context. Hours bled into one another. My fingers were soon coated in grime, and the silence, broken only by the drip of unseen pipes and the occasional distant rumble of the subway, was a profound, welcome contrast to the forced gaiety of the night before. This was my world. This was where I was competent. Around noon, I was deep in the westernmost corner, an area that smelled particularly strongly of mildew. I pulled at a box wedged between an old projector and a stack of moth-eaten velvet curtains. It was heavier than the others. I dragged it out, and the bottom immediately gave way. Instead of decorative inventory lists, a cascade of objects spilled onto the floor. Faded leather-bound notebooks, a heavy, ornate silver locket, and a small, antique wooden box with a delicate silver inlay. The notebooks weren't architectural, they were diaries. I picked one up, wiping the dust off the cover. The date scrawled inside the front cover was 1941. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably female. I didn't know who the writer was, but she had documented the theater's golden age, describing the opening nights, the costuming, and the personalities of the performers. This was history, not just of a building, but of the people who made it sing. Then I picked up the small, wooden box. It had a tiny, complex latch. I fiddled with it, and it sprang open with a soft click. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was not a missing inventory list. It was a single, thick, folded piece of vellum paper, yellowed with age, and a photograph. The photograph was black and white, slightly brittle. It was a portrait of a stunning young woman, dressed in a sweeping 1940s gown, laughing directly at the camera. Her eyes were sharp, green, and startlingly familiar. They were my eyes. I froze. My mind rejected the possibility. Coincidence, a trick of the light, but the resemblance was too strong. Too uncanny. I unfolded the vellum, my hands trembling. It wasn't a historical document, but a last will and testament dated 1943. It was from the woman in the photograph. I quickly scanned the elaborate script. The woman's name was Eliza Green, and the contents of the will were simple and shocking. Eliza Green, who looked exactly like me, was leaving all real property and personal effects, specifically excluding the contents of the theater's main safe, to her only living descendant in trust. And the name of the executor. It was my father's mother's maiden name, a name I had only ever heard whispered once, dismissively, by my mother years ago. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't just a historical project. This was personal. The woman who looked like me, who had been an integral part of the Sentinel Theater's history, was my ancestor. And this will, this dusty piece of paper found hidden in the basement, was hinting at a secret inheritance. An inheritance that, according to the document, included all real property. Could that property be a share in the Sentinel itself? I looked back at the box, then at the locket. The locket was heavy silver, intricately engraved with the initials e.g. I opened it. Inside were two tiny photos, one of the laughing woman and one of a stern but kind-faced man in a suit. My focus shifted instantly from the city council to the historical trust, from Marcus Thorne to the decades of secrets buried beneath the Sentinel's grandeur. My fight wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about my own forgotten past. And I had just stumbled into the center of a much older mystery. A mystery involving my family, an opulent theater, and a secret inheritance that had been waiting for 70 years in the dark. I tucked the box, the will, the diaries, and the photographs securely into my duffel bag, on top of my laptop. I had come to save a piece of history, but I had found a piece of myself. I climbed the steps out of the basement, my boots crunching on the stone floor. I was no longer homeless and penniless. I was heir to a ghost story. And I had to find out what all real property meant and why this story had been so carefully hidden. The discovery of Eliza Green's will and the photograph didn't just change my focus. It recontextualized my entire life. Suddenly, my mother's lifelong resistance to discussing my deceased father's family, her fervent desire to completely sever ties with the past, made chilling sense. She hadn't just been marrying muckas for stability. She had been running from a complicated, possibly dangerous history I was now literally holding in my hands. I didn't tell Elias about the will immediately. The Sentinel project was too delicate, too newly salvaged, to risk muddying it with a personal legal matter. I needed confirmation, a legal foothold, before I turned my fight from corporate politics to familial secrets. I spent the next 3 days living in a blur, research during the day, archival work in the evening, and relentless legal digging at night. My office was a small, dusty corner near the Sentinel's original box office, a space I claimed simply by placing my duffel bag there. My diet consisted primarily of vending machine coffee and stale granola bars. The constant contact with the Thutra, however, felt less like work and more like communion. I immersed myself in the diaries of Eliza Green. She had been a costumer, a brilliant artist, and the secret, beating heart of the Sentinel Thutra in the 1940s. Her entries weren't just about fabrics and fittings. They were filled with observations about the theater's primary funder, a shadowy, demanding figure she simply referred to as the banker. He controlled everything, but Eliza had a quiet, defiant power over the aesthetic soul of the place. One entry, dated October 1942, chilled me to the bone. The banker is demanding I change the mezzanine railing, says the brass is too flashy. He doesn't understand that it's not flash, it's defiance. I told him no. I believe the Thutra has secrets, but the greatest secret is that it truly belongs to the people who give it life, not the men who try to buy its silence. I will ensure its true owner is remembered, even after they succeed in burying my name. Burying my name. It sounded like a threat or a premonition. I realized I couldn't navigate this legal maze alone. I needed a lawyer who operated outside the gilded circles muckas controlled. I called Clay. "You're amazing, but you're a journalist, not an attorney," I told her over a static-laced line from the Thutra basement. "I have contacts, Clara. Lots of contacts who owe me favors for not running embarrassing stories. Give me the details. I know a guy, a brilliant, slightly unhinged man who specializes in historical property disputes and trusts. He lives for this kind of buried treasure. I met the lawyer, Mr. Alistair Finch, the next morning. He looked exactly like his description: tweed jacket, perpetually messy hair, and eyes that missed nothing. I presented him with the vellum will, the photograph of Aluzza, and the notes from my family tree research, a small, undeniable paper trail linking Aluzza Green to my father's lineage. Finch didn't scoff or seem overwhelmed. He was electrified. "This is extraordinary, Miss Thunna," he said, tapping the will with a manicured finger. "The language is legally sound, though dated. All real property. Now, the question is, what real property did Aluzza Green own in 1943? "She was a costumer," I said, frustrated. "She didn't own buildings." "Ah, but that's where the fun begins. The deed to the Sentinel Thutra has a complicated history, lots of shell corporations and trusts over the years. We need to find the original 1939 deed. If Aluzza was somehow listed as a fractional owner, or if her trust was tied to a specific section of the land, this could be a massive wrench in the works." I swallowed, the implications settling heavily. Could this will potentially challenge the current ownership of the Sentinel? Finch smiled, a wolfish, delighted expression. If she owned even 10% of the original land, and that land was never legally disposed of, then yes, Miss Thunna, you could technically be a part owner of the Sentinel Thutra. A part owner with the moral authority of having saved the rest of it, no less. The realization was staggering. I had attacked Mukazza's corporate empire to save a historical landmark, only to discover the landmark might have been my family, to begin with. Finch's immediate advice was stark. Say nothing. Do not alert the City Historical Trust, and certainly not the remaining shareholders of the Sentinel. We need to find that 1939 deed before anyone else realizes this risk. Silence is your weapon, Miss Thunna. I returned to the Thutra with a new, terrifying purpose. Elias had tasked me with searching for the decorative inventory in the main archival room, a space on the 3rd floor that had been locked since the Thutra closed. Elias had procured a key, and we entered together. The room was pristine, unlike the basement. It was a proper, climate-controlled archive filled with rows of metal cabinets. "The inventory should be here," Elias muttered, running a hand over a dusty file drawer. "It was logged as permanent collection 20 years ago." As Elias buzzed himself with the official inventory, I went straight to the oldest-looking cabinet, the one labeled Foundation and Title. I pulled open the top drawer. Inside, nestled amongst brittle lease agreements, was a heavy, embossed document. The original Sentinel Thutra Deed of Incorporation, 1939. My heart hammered. This was it. I pulled it out and scanned the list of original signatories and investors, the founding trustees. There were 3 names, 2 prominent businessmen, and then the third, E.G. Properties Trust. Finch had warned me about shell corporations. I ran my finger down the faded text. The E.G. Trust held 20% equity in the physical land of the Thutra. I turned back to the will, pulling it from my bag. Aluzza Green, E.G. Trust. It couldn't be a coincidence. I had a feeling that Aluzza Green was the E.G. Properties Trust, created to protect her interests against the banker. Elias was talking about the missing gold leaf, but I could barely hear him. I had to know who controlled E.G. Properties Trust today. I slipped the 1939 deed into my duffel bag, a desperate, professional violation of trust. This was no longer just about preserving history. It was about unearthing a hidden legacy. Back in my dusty corner office, I scanned the deed and sent it immediately to Finch with a one-word text. Confirmed. Minutes later, Finch called. His voice was hushed, urgent. "Clara, this is huge. That 20% is immensely valuable. I ran the E.G. Trust name through modern property registries. It was dissolved, legally killed, in 1968. The land equity reverting to the 2 other original trustees. Except what? Except there's a small, almost invisible clause in the dissolution papers. It stipulated that the dissolution could be challenged if the original owner's last will was presented before 2025. It's an insane, highly specific clause, almost certainly forgotten. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the date is: "You are holding Eliza Green's last will, dated 1943. It supersedes the 1968 dissolution. Clara, that 20% equity is still legally tied up, pending the establishment of Eliza Green's rightful heir." I looked down at the duffel bag, at the will, and the photograph of the laughing woman who shared my fierce green eyes. I was her rightful heir. I wasn't just the savior of the Sentinel. I was its secret, sleeping owner. And I had 6 months before the clause expired. My life wasn't just starting, it was about to ignite. I had to find a way to claim the equity and use the 20% share to not only secure the Sentinel's future forever, but to finally face the people who had tried to erase my family's connection to it. The stakes had just risen beyond money and pride. This was about blood and bricks. The realization that I was the rightful, secret heir to 20% of the Sentinel Theater's physical property was a tidal wave. It made the conflict with Marcus look like a skirmish. Now, I was facing a 70-year-old legal conspiracy, likely designed to erase my great-grandmother, Eliza Green, from history. Finch's instructions were clear. Move fast, but move invisibly. If the remaining original co-owners, or more accurately, their modern corporate descendants, discovered the existence of Eliza's superseding will, they would launch a legal counterattack designed to bury me in paperwork and debt. The deadline for presenting the will was looming, and I was running on borrowed time, both legally and financially. My first task was to secure the physical proof. I couldn't risk leaving Eliza's original documents, the will, the diaries, the photograph, in the dusty corner of the theater. I needed a secure place. My own apartment was non-existent, and I couldn't trust any of my old contacts in the city. I called Chloe. "I need a safe deposit box, Chloe, today, under a name that has nothing to do with Thorn or Green." Chloe, ever the pragmatist, had it handled within the hour. She sent me a location downtown and a key, no questions asked. The fact that she didn't ask was a silent testament to the gravity of the situation. She knew I was navigating something far bigger than a corporate feud. With the documents safely deposited, I could focus on my role at the Sentinel. Elia's was ecstatic. The city council, under intense public scrutiny, had not only released the structural report, but was fast-tracking preservation permits. We were now moving into the detailed archival phase, the search for all the blueprints, material inventories, and decorative designs. This was my cover. My deep dive into the theater's official archives wasn't just work. It was my excavation of Eliza's life and her conflict with the banker. I had to identify him. I suspected he was one of the 2 other original trustees listed on the 1939 deed. I spent days poring over decades of receipts, memos, and correspondence. The other 2 trustees were Victor Sterling and Harold Wexler. Sterling was a renowned philanthropist, Wexler a shadowy finance tycoon. Eliza's diaries provided the clues. One entry read, "Harold is furious about the expense of the European glass, says it's unnecessary flash. He would rather the theater be a warehouse for his ego than a stage for life. If he cancels the order, I swear I will replace it with my own money. He is the banker, but I am the true foundation." Harold Wexler. He was the banker. Wexler's line had eventually absorbed Sterling's interests in the 1968 dissolution of the E.G. Trust, becoming the sole, non-descendant owner of the Sentinel land. Wexler's descendants controlled a large, conservative investment firm, Wexler Capital, which was currently in silent opposition to the Sentinel's preservation. I had identified my target. Wexler Capital was the true antagonist. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother, Amelia. It was the first direct communication since the night I was thrown out. "Clara, we need to talk. Marcus is going to divorce me. He says I raised a traitor. He's freezing accounts. I have nowhere to go. Please call me. Your allowance is gone. Mom." The text hit me with a jolt of cold, complicated guilt. Her fear was real, but so was her decade of complicity. She hadn't reached out to offer support or to ask for forgiveness. She was seeking a new financial lifeline because the old one had been severed. I typed a short, brutal reply. "You chose him, Mom. I have nothing left to give you. I'm starting over." I hit send and immediately blocked her number. I couldn't afford the distraction or the emotional blackmail. I had to choose myself and Eliza's legacy over the wreckage of her marriage. Finch called the next day. "Clara, I found the missing piece. The 1968 dissolution of E.G. Trust. It was handled by Wexler's personal lawyer at the time. It was a clean, legal burial. Too clean. But I found a reference to a sealed writer concerning the theater's original main safe." I leaned closer to the phone. The main safe? Eliza's will excluded the contents of the main safe from her personal effects. She didn't want me to have whatever was in there. But if Wexler's lawyer included it in the dissolution, what was its purpose? The writer states that the safe's contents, whatever they are, will act as the governing legal document for any dispute involving the 20% equity. In other words, if Eliza wanted her heir to claim the property, she hid the final, necessary piece of evidence in that safe. I ran my hand across the wall where the original box office was located, now mostly rubble. The main safe has to be near the box office. That's standard theater design. "We need to find it, Clara. We need the contents of that safe before Wexler Capital realizes you have the will and orders the entire building gutted under the pretense of structural necessity. This isn't just a legal battle anymore. It's a treasure hunt." I hung up, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. Eliza had anticipated the betrayal. She hadn't just left a will, she had left a trail. She knew the banker would try to erase her, so she locked the final key inside the very core of the building. I located the original blueprints. They were complex, almost impenetrable, but my architectural history training finally paid off. I traced the thick lines of the walls near the old box office. There it was, a heavily reinforced, unmarked square tucked into the wall behind a plaster panel. The main safe. It wasn't a modern combination lock. It was an old, tumbler-style safe requiring a specific, complex sequence. I grabbed Eliza's diaries from my bag, the only objects she had intentionally left for me. I frantically flipped through the pages, looking for a number, a date, a code. Nothing explicit. Then I noticed a pattern. She rarely used dates, preferring cryptic notations tied to performances. Opening night of The Great Illusionist, followed by The Music Was 10:22:4. And another, closing night of The Grand Ballerina. The critic called it a 5:30:18. My mind clicked. The numbers weren't just descriptions, they were tumbler sequences. But which one was the right one? I looked at the original photograph of Eliza again, her laughing face, her familiar green eyes. And I remembered the date on the will, 1943. I raced over to the wall where the safe was hidden, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm. I didn't have a chisel or a crowbar. I needed a sign. I needed the final piece of the code. My eyes fell on the silver locket Eliza had hidden in the box. I opened it. Inside were the two tiny photos, Eliza and the stern, kind-faced man. The stern man in the photograph had to be the final piece. But who was he? I checked the very last entry in Eliza's diary, dated December 31st, 1943, days before her presumed death. It was a simple, heartbreaking sentence. "I named the safe after the one man who gave me light, my father, William." William, I checked my father's family history notes, a scant, sad collection of facts. My paternal grandfather's name was William. Eliza's son, my great-uncle, was William, the man in the photograph. I suddenly knew the sequence. It wasn't dates or reviews. It was a hidden tribute. The numbers had to be my grandfather William's birth date. I pulled the census records I had copied weeks ago. William Green, born 07-15-1923. I found a small piece of metal, a forgotten hinge, and began scraping away the plaster panel. It gave way, revealing a heavy steel door with an aged brass tumbler dial. I took a deep breath, fighting the shaking in my hands. 7-15-23. The mechanism groaned. the tumblers clicking into place with agonizing slowness. And then, with a heavy, profound sound that echoed the truth, the safe door sprung open. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, just one object, a perfectly preserved, slightly yellowed certificate of sale from 1943. I pulled it out. It wasn't a deed. It was a sale document. Eliza Green sold her 20% equity to the Sentinel Historical Trust, a fledgling organization, for $1. The shock was immediate and absolute. She hadn't left me an inheritance of money or property. She had left me an inheritance of altruism. The certificate had a clause, written in Eliza's elegant hand and notarized. This sale is voided, and the equity returns to my heir if at any point the Sentinel Historical Trust acts to dissolve the theater's original structure, or if the trust is purchased by Wexler Capital or its direct subsidiaries. She didn't want the property. She wanted the building protected forever. And she had used her 20% to create a legal poison pill, ensuring that if Wexler Capital ever tried to acquire the theater, as they were doing right now through back channels, the 20% would revert to her bloodline, making the acquisition legally impossible. Eliza hadn't been fighting for profit. She was fighting for preservation, and she had left the final, magnificent piece of leverage to me. I gripped the certificate, the paper warm against my palm. I finally understood the full scope of my inheritance. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a mandate. I had the power to stop the most powerful investment firm in the city from ever touching the Sentinel. I called Finch, the certificate clutched in my hand. Alistair, I found the document. It's not a claim on property, it's a legal bomb. The certificate of sale was the perfect checkmate. It was a document born of love for the Sentinel and utter distrust of money men like Harold Wexler. It didn't just prevent the worst outcome, it gave me the ultimate negotiating leverage. I met Finch at his office the next day. The certificate lay between us, a brittle, powerful testament to Eliza Green's foresight. Eliza was brilliant, Finch said, his eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. She didn't want the property for herself. She wanted to ensure it remained public art. She sold it to the Historical Trust to secure preservation funding, but she built a tripwire into the sale itself. If Wexler Capital, or any of its subsidiaries, like the one trying to muscle in now, attempts to acquire the trust or destroy the building, her 20% reverts directly to you, the heir. That 20% share, at today's valuation, would be enough to collapse any acquisition deal and tie the entire property in litigation for a decade. So they can't buy it, and they can't touch the original structure, I summarized, feeling a profound sense of vindication. I hold the ultimate veto power. Precisely, Finch confirmed. But here's the critical next step. You can't just send this to Wexler Capital. They will immediately try to discredit the document, or you. We need to use this to neutralize their opposition to the preservation. Your victory with Marcus and the city council was the appetizer. This is the main course. We formulated a plan that was as precise and architectural as my original intervention. The quiet takedown. I had Elias Vance, my actual boss and now my unwitting ally, schedule a private, final review meeting with the representatives of the two primary opposing forces, the current Sentinel Historical Trust board members and the silent, corporate entity funding the opposition, Wexler Capital's local council. The meeting was set for Friday evening, 3 days away, in a conference room at a neutral venue downtown. Elias believed the meeting was to finalize the site control agreement and secure a non-interference pledge from Wexler. He had no idea I was bringing a 70-year-old bomb to the table. My role was to be the quiet, indispensable historian. I spent the next 3 days preparing a comprehensive presentation detailing the Sentinel's historical significance, its structural requirements, and most importantly, the cost of litigation. I meticulously gathered documents proving Wexler Capital's continued, quiet funding of the opposition groups. The most difficult preparation, however, was psychological. I knew Marcus Thorne, my stepfather, would be attending as a proxy for his own defeated corporate interest, which still owned the adjacent land parcel. He would be there, cold, arrogant, and determined to salvage his reputation. I had to face the man who had discarded me without a trace of the fear or guilt that had plagued me. Friday arrived, and I walked into the sleek, high-rise conference room. The atmosphere was thick with corporate tension. The long mahogany table was occupied by Elias, 2 weary members of the trust, and across from them, 3 sharp-suited lawyers. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the lawyer's side, looking every inch the powerful man I remembered, albeit with sharper, more dangerous eyes. He didn't acknowledge me, not even a flicker of recognition. I was invisible again, which was exactly what I needed to be. I sat next to Elias, a quiet, ink-stained ghost. The meeting began with Elias' professional overview, followed by the inevitable posturing from the Wexler Council, a stiff, gray-haired woman named Ms. Davies. "We respect the preservation," Ms. Davies droned, "but the continued cost overruns and structural questions concern our investors. We simply seek an assurance that the city can terminate the project if it becomes a white elephant." Marcus spoke next, his voice smooth and controlled, dripping with patronizing concern. "As the adjacent landholder, we simply want stability. The Sentinel project presents an unacceptable level of financial and social instability. This project needs a fail-safe." He looked pointedly at Elias, not me. It was my turn. Elias nodded for me to present the archival details. I stood up, pushing back my chair. I didn't reach for a projector or a laser pointer. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the 1939 original deed of incorporation and the 1968 dissolution of E.G. Trust. "I am Clara Thorne," I began, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the polished corporate air. "I am the lead historian on this project, and before we discuss fail-safes, I believe we need to discuss title." Ms. Davies' face remained impassive. Marcus finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of irritation, not concern. "Ms. Thorne," he interjected smoothly, "we've settled the land parcel dispute, the city council." "I'm not discussing your land parcel, Marcus." I cut him off, using his first name with deliberate coolness. I looked directly at Ms. Davies. "I am discussing the E.G. Properties Trust, which owned 20% of the Sentinel land and was dissolved in 1968 with a specific clause concerning the will of the original owner, Eliza Green." The name hung in the air. Ms. Davies shifted uncomfortably. This was not in her briefing materials. "Ms. Thorne, that trust is legally defunct," Ms. Davies stated, a hint of steel entering her voice. "It is, Ms. Davies, but its dissolution is voidable," I countered, pulling out the photograph of Eliza Green and laying it on the table. "This is Eliza Green, the original owner of E.G. Trust. I am her great-granddaughter and sole living heir." I then placed the 1943 will on the table. I didn't give them time to react. I went straight to the kill. "I know your firm, Wexler Capital, has been quietly funding the opposition to this preservation. You are hoping the trust fails so you can buy the whole property for cheap. What you don't know is that Eliza Green was well aware of your predecessor's intentions. She was the one who nicknamed Harold Wexler, the banker, in her private diaries." I paused for dramatic effect, then delivered the final blow, placing the 1943 certificate of sale in front of Ms. Davies. In 1943, Eliza Green sold her 20% equity to the Historical Trust to ensure the building's survival. The sale contained a reversionary clause. If Wexler Capital, or any subsidiary, attempts to acquire the trust or acts to destroy the original structure, a structure Wexler's counsel is currently seeking a fail-safe to destroy, the 20% equity immediately reverts to me, the heir. I pushed the documents toward them, my heart hammering in my chest. This reversion voids any current acquisition attempt and guarantees an endless, publicly embarrassing litigation war for that 20% share, a war I am now financially prepared to fight. Ms. Davies went white. Her composure evaporated. She looked at Marcus Thorne, who was staring at me with an expression that had morphed from cold irritation to pure, stunned recognition. He saw not the girl he threw out, but the powerful enemy who understood the true language of leverage. "This document is," Ms. Davies stammered. "Genuine," Finch's voice cut in, as he stepped in from the side door where he had been waiting. And notarized, I am Ms. Thorne's counsel. The reversion is automatic and effective the moment a threat is posed. I suggest you advise your client that the Sentinel Theater is legally untouchable by Wexler Capital. Your only recourse is to retreat and fully fund the preservation to eliminate the voiding condition. The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and ragged, his polished veneer shattered. Amelia told me she couldn't reach you, he said, ignoring everyone else. She said you were being difficult. I looked him straight in the eye, devoid of emotion. I stopped being difficult when I stopped being yours. I used your own playbook, Marcus. You taught me that leverage is everything. Now you have none. I turned back to the Wexler lawyers. This meeting is over. The Sentinel is saved. Now you will guarantee a no-interference pact, or we start filing the reversion claim Monday morning. Choose. Ms. Davies, defeated, looked at Marcus. He nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes still fixed on me, a new, grudging respect and profound hatred swirling within them. We agree to a no-interference pact, Ms. Davies conceded, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded once, then gathered my documents, Eliza's photo, and my briefcase. I had saved the building and shattered the corporate opposition. The Sentinel was finally free. As I walked toward the door, Marcus stood up. Clara, wait. I paused. Your mother, Amelia needs help. She has nothing, she's your mother. I stopped at the doorway and turned, the finality in my voice chilling even to my own ears. Tell her that. Tell her the woman who taught me how to find my own power is the one who saved her from poverty, not the one who saved a building. I'll send her the money for a decent apartment and living expenses under one condition. She never contacts me again. My family isn't based on blood or money, Marcus. It's based on legacy. And mine starts now. I walked out, leaving the stunned, defeated corporate world behind. I had won the war, not for a seat at their table, but to burn their whole damn kitchen down and build my own monument in the ashes. The final part of the story was no longer about survival, but about creation. The conference room dissolved behind me. I didn't glance back at Marcus or the defeated Wexler Council. That chapter was closed, the victory complete. The Sentinel was secured, not by lobbying or sheer financial force, but by the intelligence and selflessness of a woman who had lived decades before me, a woman whose blood ran in my veins. Finch met me in the hallway, his face alight with professional exhilaration. Clara, that was magnificent, a total victory. The Wexler lawyers will advise immediate withdrawal. They won't risk the litigation. What about Marcus? I asked, my voice flat. Thorne, he's neutralized. His land parcel is now entirely surrounded by a legally protected historical monument. His commercial tower plan is dead. His only option is to sell to the city at their price or sit on unusable land. Finch paused, then added gently, You broke the financial ecosystem they built, Clara. You're free. Free but exhausted. I had my inheritance, not money, but purpose. The next day, I started the real work of preservation. My dusty corner office became my command center. I had no furniture, only my laptop, Eliza's diaries, and a growing stack of architectural blueprints. Elias Vance, completely oblivious to the legal maneuvers but thrilled by the results, gave me total autonomy. My job expanded from historian to project lead for archival restoration. I was no longer just searching for documents. I was breathing life back into the Sentinel. I worked 18-hour days. I supervised the initial cleanup, crawling through vents to check the original copper wiring, consulting with specialized artisans on the terracotta facade, and meticulously matching the 1940s color palettes found in Eliza's meticulous notes. The theater wasn't just a job. It was my home, the living embodiment of my great-grandmother's defiant spirit. Weeks turned into months. The initial funding, now unblocked, started pouring in. The scaffolding went up, transforming the exterior from a ruin into a promise. My story, the girl who saved the city landmark from her own power-hungry stepfather, had become local legend. News articles painted me as a tireless, almost mythic figure, the Sentinel savior. But I shunned the cameras, focusing instead on the deep, satisfying work of creation. One chilly evening, 7 months after I was kicked out, the main stage was finally cleared of debris. It was a vast, echoing space, still rough but full of potential. I was standing in the empty auditorium, staring at the stage where Eliza's performers once danced, when Elias walked in, holding a small, rolled-up poster. "Clara, I need your sign-off on the historical accuracy of this," he said, unrolling the vibrant, restored poster for a production scheduled in 2 years, the grand reopening. The title was simple, elegant, "The Green Light." I traced the lettering with my finger, a slow, deep smile spreading across my face. Eliza Green. The theater was finally getting the light she deserved. "It's perfect, Elias. The typography, the colors, the emotion. It's absolutely perfect," I said, my voice thick. "Good, because I also need you to sign this." He handed me a legal document. It was a contract for my position, not as project lead, but as director of the Sentinel Historical Trust. I looked up at him, stunned. "Director, Elias, I'm only 23, and my background is purely research." "Your background is integrity and ferocity," Elias countered, a rare, powerful emotion in his eyes. "You secured the funding, broke the opposition, and you're the only person in this city who sees this building as a living being, not a balance sheet. The old board members resigned after the scandal, and the new board voted unanimously. The Sentinel is your legacy, Clara. You built this." I signed the contract, the pen feeling heavy and momentous in my hand. Director Thorne. It carried a weight entirely different from the name my mother wore. 2 days later, I was giving a private tour to the city council members, showing them the initial progress. They were appropriately impressed, deferential, and careful to avoid any mention of past conflicts. As we walked through the lobby, I saw a familiar flash of sapphire in the crowd near the entrance. My mother, Amelia. She was standing next to a small woman wearing a plain tweed suit. Amelia's hair wasn't perfectly coiffed, her dress was slightly too tight, and she looked diminished, but her eyes, when they finally met mine, held a strange mix of regret and pride. I broke away from the tour and walked toward her. "Clara," she whispered, her voice fragile, "I just wanted to see you. You're doing such incredible work." I looked at the woman beside her. "And who is this?" Amelia took a deep breath. "This is Mrs. Wallace. She's the social worker from the city housing program. Your funds were enough for me to get a small apartment, but I needed to find a job, Clara. Mrs. Wallace helped me. She found me a placement." My heart, which I thought was encased in thick historical armor, softened. "A job, Mom? What are you doing?" "I'm working at the local library in the archival department," she said, managing a small, tentative smile. "It's quiet. It's just me and the books. It turns out I'm quite good at organizing history. I just needed to be in a place where people valued silence and records." I realized then that she hadn't been running from the past. She had been running from the noise of Marcus's world. Maybe she, too, was finally finding her place of quiet competence. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Good, Mom. I'm glad." She didn't try to hug me or apologize again. She just looked at the massive, soaring architecture around us, a genuine awe in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Clara. You found your inheritance." I watched her walk away with Mrs. Wallace, a solitary, determined figure heading toward a quiet, useful life. I turned back to the building, my eyes sweeping over the massive, soaring dome. It was a cold, beautiful structure of brick and metal, but I knew its real foundation: legacy, love, and the ferocious power of a truth that wouldn't stay buried. I was Clara Thorne, director of the Sentinel Historical Trust. I was Eliza Green's heir. I had saved the building, and in doing so, I had finally built a life where I was not just invited, but essential.